good morning or afternoon, depending on wherever you are in the world. My name is Jim Tyrrell. I'm a senior principal solutions architect at Red Hat. I've spent a long time thinking about being a Java developer, and then of course, spending a long time thinking about human experience. But with that, let's dive in. Along the way, if you wish to interrupt me with questions, I've got the chat open here to my right-hand side. Feel free to type along anything that you get along the way. At the end, if you want to come off mute or just do things in chat to respect your privacy, hey, I'm down with whatever you want to do. So a little bit about myself. I'm 25 plus years, probably 27 years as a Java developer. I started hanging out in the Java space in 1995. For at least 12 years, and really since the beginning of time, I've been very passionate of user experience and where computers and humans meet. Finishing up 6 years ago, I earned a Master's of Design Methods from what one of my professors calls the hardest design school on the planet. And this is probably the hardest design school because it's not art, colors, and fonts, but it's actually strategy, innovation, and leadership. And I have spent decades thinking about the intersection of humans and design and computers. And that's kind of where I'm coming at when I give you this talk around 10 design tips for microservices developers. With that, maybe a few brilliant books, and it's over here to my left-hand side. The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. Some of you might know Don Norman. I don't know if you want to throw that in the chat that you've heard of Don Norman. But if you didn't know him, he was at Apple in the early 90s, and he coined a term by the term of user experience or UX. Right, that was one of the first times that term had ever been uttered. A total luminary in this space, and just somebody that I really look up to, and just a great speaker if you get a chance to see him virtually or on YouTube. Another book off to my left-hand side here in my home office, Coders by Clive Thompson. Clive Thompson speaks, or writes rather, for Wired Magazine, among many other places. And as I read that book a couple summers ago, the thing that really hit me as I was reading that was this concept that us coders, those of us who do software development day in and day out, make tons of what I would label design decisions in the context of my master's program, yet we, in our backgrounds, in our day-to-day lives, don't really have any backing or training in design, at least as I think of it and as I define it. And I think that's really an interesting thought. And then another book that I absolutely loved, now probably 8-9 years old for me reading it, but going back to the early 2000s, by Alan Cooper. You might not know Alan Cooper by name, but you certainly know some of the products he worked on at Microsoft, working on some of the first iterations of what ultimately became .NET, but things like Visual Basic and other things in that late 90s, early 2000s time period. And Gleam noticed the Norman door, right? I have countless pictures of my travels of doors that you don't know whether you should push them or pull them. And I'm sure somewhere in the next 24 hours, you will think of a Norman door as you think about that. One of the things that we've seen in software for a long time is the Death Star, right? The Death Star of all these microservices that are communicating to each other through a centralized interface, except we as humans are very malleable and very guidable if we tell you what it is, something that you're looking at. So in a real room, physically in space, I would have had people raise their hands. Have you seen this picture before? The one that I had there prior, hands would have gone up. But if you zoom in on it, what you're really looking at is this codex around behavioral biases and cognitive biases that we as humans have. This codex has, I think, almost 200 at this point. There are so many biases we as humans have. We as a species are definitely not as black and white as computers are. There's a fundamental mismatch there that I think is absolutely amazing, but it is also interesting and also very problematic. And we'll get into some of the stuff that's going on there. But you probably have seen these pictures from the early 2015, 2014 in that time period, right? These were Twitter and Netflix shared their current microservices architecture. Microservices certainly have been the programming du jour for a long time. There's something that we are thinking about as an industry. There's something that we are trying to figure out how to do more with and to deploy them, but they come with some problems, right? You know, as these graphs depict, there's a whole lot of cross communication that is going on with these. And just how do you manage that complexity? How do you deal with all those interfaces? And, you know, at least in the Twitter graph in the lower right-hand corner, I don't know if my mouse comes through, but in the lower right-hand corner of this, there's a green set of lines that I'm assuming goes through some sort of authentication piece that everybody is communicating to. And that certainly is potentially a single point of failure. But then there's also the notion of how do you test this many permutations, right? And let's dive into some of the thoughts that are around that in a second. But first, right, I said I was a Java developer from way back, been in the Java ecosystem for my entire professional life. I absolutely love Java. I love a typed, checked programming language. I love object-oriented development. But if we go back to the late 90s, we had this idea of the Java bean specification, right? A no argument constructor, private member variables, and a bunch of getters and setters on all those member variables is a very common design pattern, if you will, around this creation of these objects, right? And we did this in our monolithic Java EE or J2EE or our war and ear files. We've done this in all of our enterprise applications for a very long time. Hopefully, if you were in an enlightened organization, these little holders of data had toString methods on them. As I look at GitHub projects, download things, it is always horrifying to me to not see a toString method, just to kind of give me an idea about what kind of output, what kind of data is being stored. How does the developer think this thing might come together, or what can I do with it? I get test cases help you a little bit with that, but there's a lot more cruft around test cases with building things up, tearing things down. It just hurts my comprehension of what it is that's going on, right? There's a notion of wayfinding in your code that I think is slowed down a little bit by a lack of a toString method. But, so monolith, right? We've done this monolith stuff. We've done Java beans with zero argument constructor, private member variables, and getters and setters forever. And if we think about all the communication that might happen in a typical application, right? If we have 10 classes that communicate to each other, the number of communication paths in this case is 45, right? And that's basically in any order, just, how many different communication paths are there, and how can you put things together? And that's, kind of implying some order to that. If you go a little bit deeper on that, what happens if each of those classes has 5 methods that could communicate with each other, right? What does that mean for how many communication paths there might be across your classes that are communicating with each other? And the thing I would ask you to think a little bit about is how many of these paths could you ultimately end up testing if you have to write 1,225 test cases in this case to test potentially every permutation of how things might be called backwards and forwards across your stack of classes and how things are invoked. And I think it also gets a little bit worse that if you have any order of any communication, right, and how can you put these things in order? If you have 5 methods and 10 classes, is there a possibility that you have a 50 factorial communication problem going on across all these methods? And I get with object-oriented programming, there is some ordering implied. There is some stuff that probably limits this number. But, 50 factorial for reference is 3 times 10 to the 64th. To put that in perspective, the number of atoms in you are 10 to the 17th or 18th. The number of atoms in the universe are 10 to the 70th, they think. In other words, when we have these very large sprawling code bases with very large numbers of people that are communicating and developing in them, the number of paths that are correct, right, the one that you're testing and delivering might only be, a very small percentage of the possible cases that a developer or user might have in your sprawling pile of classes. And if you go back to those Twitter and Netflix examples, right, those were several hundred microservices communicating with each other. Does that mean the possibility is that there's a 500 factorial on the number of permutations that are there for everybody talking to everybody else? I would argue there probably is. And the ability for us to test all those permutations is probably nearly zero. And I think as a kind of a corollary, or relating that to public getters and setters, which is kind of where we'll get into the meat of the talk here in a second, the amount of cross-contamination and communication that's going on is nearly bottomless and infinite. And that we as developers, and especially in Java, have this ability to do something that I think is kind of unique and fun that I'll introduce here in the next little bit. So, 500 microservices, all those communicating to everybody else in any order, right? You get potentially a 500 factorial problem. Even if you only limit it to just a few things, it's 500 times 499 times 498, right? The numbers with just even 4 or 5 communicating with each other just get to be absolutely massive. And then the other thing is that each of these dots, each of these little words that are emanating from the center, if you will, right? Each of those 500 things around the circle, they also could have public methods on them, so that the communication possibilities between all these microservices isn't just the graph lines between these endpoints. It's potentially between all the individual classes along the way. So the amount of complexity we're delivering I would argue in this is far in excess of any one person's brain to just comprehend it. And let's think about some of the things that are going on here. And I think my hypothesis I'm putting out in the world today, and I've been giving this talk for a couple of weeks now, is getting rid of this idea of public getters and setters, and really getting rid of all public methods as a rule in your classes and doing something else to slow down the blast radius of what's going on within your code base. So before we get into that, just two other books that I really, really love. Domain-driven design is this idea that we use entities or actions or primarily nouns, but not always. The things that we're creating our software around, we're going to give those things domain names that we're going to then use. We'll get to that in a second. Another book that I love, this book, Switch, by Chip and Dan Heath. They have a lot of ideas they have in their book to get you to change your behavior. But one of the things they talk about is tweak the environment, right? Basically making it such that your users can't fail no matter what they do, that you're going to give them a curated, guided journey that they can't mess up. They can't screw something up. And of course, my wife does this, and luckily she's not home today. But she likes to put the bags that are supposed to go back in my car by the front door. I happily step over them. So certainly you can't undo the programming in the wetware necessarily, but definitely something to think about. So, domain-driven development, tweaking the environment. Let's dive into what we're talking about a little bit with this. Oh, the clicker is not clicking. Here we go. Let's see. All right, we're back. So in Java, we've done this forever, right? We have had this structure that looks like this: package com, Acme, company name, and then something like controller domain repository service. And I've seen this in countless customer engagements where literally each of these folders have hundreds of files in them. I have watched people scroll for minutes while they're trying to find the 3 or 4 files that make up a request across these 4 different folders or packages that are going on in Java. In a very unadvanced world, and certainly, I'm not going to raise my hand, but maybe I've done this. You might even have just user.java across all these different folders. And against wayfinding, looking at your IDE, trying to figure out where and what to look at, I would say that this is a tremendous anti-pattern to just name these things user.java. And I would also argue that these folders and package structure of old doesn't really lend itself to a nice, easy, compact thing that can be well tested that we'll explore here in a bit. So using a little bit of domain-driven design or development, rather than just having those prior structures, we might put our package names around things like user, registration, settings, the different domains, if you will, the different modalities that are going to be in your application. And actually, as I think about this, I like putting them in capitalization for that, at least that last area. To me, it just gives it a little bit more, I don't know, it just makes me feel like it looks a little bit more important than I think it does. It's just a regular package name. It also, gives you as the developer this idea that, hey, I'm in the user space and I need to kind of page that into my brain and think about what that means at this point. You also might have some notions around common things. We'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the talk. There's maybe certain things around common APIs, common objects that you want to pass between these different structures that'll maybe make a little bit more sense in a bit. But at the top level, this is something for us to think about, to have a much smaller, much less bloated number of files in these directories, and then consolidate into a single folder the domain or the kind of thing that you're managing or dealing with at that point in time. Going on to another level, and this is kind of a structure I came up with against the Red Hat Quarkus framework, but I think this would work in Java in general. For this, I have this naming convention of API at the top. That is the thing that defines my JSON speaking web service. Model and persistence are basically holder objects, Java beans, if you will, in the purest sense, in that they just store data and the annotations that are specific to that. So the model class would have an example of just having member variables in it with annotations that speak to how things are written to and from JSON objects from the web. Persistence.java is the same thing. Again, just member variables that are just having the annotations about what it takes to write information to the database. And then finally, that service.java is dealing with persisting those objects to the database or maybe writing to a message queue, etc. So anyway, that's kind of what's going on there with that naming convention. Of course, the challenge I have is that across these different domain packages, the API name by itself would be kind of bad, going back to that user example of earlier. Rather than doing that, let's put our domain name into the file name of this. And I get this is a little bit duplicative, but you know what? In our modern IDEs with or auto completion, I really don't think this adds that much typing to you as a user. And it really gives you context or wayfinding for you as a developer to know where it is and what it is you're looking at when you're looking at things in the IDE. And of course, these stack alphabetically in the IDE. So the entry point is kind of on the top. Writing things out to the database is at the bottom, with the data models sitting there in the middle between model and persistent. So that's just one of the conventions that I've been thinking about with this. And you think, this isn't that great of an idea, maybe. And, I've talked to some developers that have already organically gone down this with domain-driven development, but I still think you have some of the problems of public getters and setters on this structure that we'll talk about here in a second, right? That cross-communication across all those different tick marks around these circles could basically be endless if every class has tons of getters and setters around, and just public methods in general around those objects. So then, rather than just having all these extra words here, which is kind of something that I think about when I'm thinking about user experience, is that every word should have a purpose in your class files. And I would argue that the words public on a class, the word private on the member variable, and then having those getters and stringers as getters and setters is a lot of cruft, a lot of extra words that you as a human have to deal with, especially in the context of just that JSON property of first name being stored off. So those public keywords, I think, create some problems against my hypothesis. And rather than doing that, what I would suggest is we potentially get rid of this idea of the public getters and setters, and instead use an empty modifier on our member variables, or use the keyword default, which allows us to do some inheritance. This slows down the blast radius of how far and wide that model user instance can be used across different packages within your ecosystem of classes. So within the domain package, say in this case, org.acme.user, only people within this class, or within that package rather, of user, can access this data model, if you will. And by putting just those JSON annotations on this, I'm allowing myself to just kind of play with the JSON object and deal with it in space right there. I don't have to think about the database annotations in there. I don't have to mark fields as things that shouldn't be written out to the database. I could just think about one thing and one thing only as I'm writing this. I would also challenge you to think a little bit about the fact that potentially, because of the access that's available through your fields, removing public probably makes a lot of sense on this class too at a top level. Again, just giving you the access for this class and this package only for this class. What you are doing and where you're getting to is you're just slowing down the amount of cross-contamination that can go on with this particular object. And then, going on with this, rather than having, private member variables, we get rid of those, right? So kind of the most actualized version of this class is this idea of basically an empty, no argument constructor is implied, but no keyword modifier of either public or private on your classes or member variables. My suggestion is that you would only have empty just to slow down the cognitive load on your brain, or protected if you really wanted to, if you wanted to do some inheritance down the tree or up the tree, depending on how you look at that. It's always been interesting to me in computer science that people look at trees either up or down. I guess they would be tree up because that's the way people look at them, but I've always looked at them down because that's how they render in your IDE and your file explorer. So what goes on with this is that, visually you could kind of think about this, right? That on the left-hand side of this picture is a JSON speaking client, right? Postman, a web browser, a smart app on your phone. That speaks to the API user object, which speaks JSON. That model user is then marshaled and unmarshaled by the runtime, typically to inject it in that API user and make that available to you. You need to do some copying then probably of that model user to a persistence user object to hold the persistence annotations that are specific to that. In the case of Quarkus, then that services user would use the Panache implementation of a JPA provider to help that. And what's going on with this is that without protected or default in this example, anybody could talk to anybody else across your entire code base. And I think that leads itself to a couple problems, especially in microservices. One is the amount of bugs that could be introduced by everybody talking to everybody else. But then if I want to segment off something and stand it up as a true microservice, now I have a dependency in some code that might be running somewhere else in my application in a different VM, maybe even in a different data center or a different, complete runtime. What I'm suggesting by this is what ends up happening is you basically create a JVM enforced firewall at the package level of what it is that you're writing, such that the compiler will enforce that no one can do any bad acting across reaching into this package, if you will, from other packages. This should slow down massively the number of communication channels that you're having between your different objects to make your life just a little bit easier as a developer, as a tester, QAer. You should be able to wrap your head around what needs to be validated. In this case, I would argue it's probably the JSON speaking endpoints and the writing things out to the database. We'll talk about that in a second. But this idea to me is that the package now becomes the object, right? Our systems have become so complex. The numbers of annotations we're expected to know, the different kinds of data in and out, and where it's being sourced from and written out to is so complex that we just can't wrap our brains around all of this. And by keeping our modality or our use of each of these four classes of this example to a very specific use case, it's very easy for you to open up these classes and look at what's going on in it and then make changes to it, and rinse, wash, repeat as you make changes to this. Too many of our examples in Java in general blur all four of these into one object. Everything's public, everything's available. There's piles of getters and setters. There's just a lot of extra words that you as a human have to dig through to make this work. And I get that in an IDE, you can right click and generate getters and setters. And I think people think that that activity is free. It is until you want to rename first name, and this would probably be a bad example, to lowercase n. What happens to your getters and setters in that case, right? The IDE doesn't automatically refactor that for you. What about if you add a new member variable, then you've got to remember to add those getters and setters for maybe down the road, So there's just a lot of stuff, a lot of extra activity, a lot of mental anguish, if you will, that has to go along with that type of change with that. So another thing that I like, I'm of the opinion that these two data objects in the middle, the model user and the persistence user in this case, should have two string methods on them. We should definitely have this idea of available to us. And I get that it's really easy in the IDE to do this. I have, as I've been writing code in this style, a lot of times if I just do a simple log statement or print out even, I know that's horrible at times, but if you just do a simple log statement of the state of that object, you could see that something wasn't marshaled from the end user as you thought from your Postman client or your browser, or it wasn't being copied or persisted all the way into your database. So just having that out there, I think that helps a lot. One of the analogies I give at this point is that I view writing software a lot like writing a book, right? And the book output isn't a book of chapters and numbered pages and sources and whatnot. The book is actually a series of things that you read together. And, kind of like a book, when you're looking at log output of your running program, you can really see, did the story come together, right? I put in some data from a JSON object, that was marshaled into this object, did that happen correctly? Then I would do some manipulation to it. What does that look like after I do some manipulation to it? Then I might want to put it into a database and look at that there. And along the way, just simple logging out to the console makes my life a lot easier, just to make sure that that story has come together right. And there aren't any jarring plot changes or points that just don't feel right as I'm looking at my software. So this idea of the JVM enforced firewall, I think, creates a couple other things that I think can help us out as we think about this a little bit. So as we think about this JSON speaking endpoint at the entry point of this thing, I think a good JSON speaking endpoint should always have a good HTTP response code, right? 200, 400 for, not found, 500s around not having access. But I also think that it's really important that these endpoints have some sort of human readable strings around them. So there's a couple different ways that manifests itself to me. One would be a good error message string about what might be the next best action if something isn't correct. Another one that I can't stand is a white screen of death, right? If I put something into an endpoint and all I get back is a white screen of death, I think you are doing your end users a huge disservice. What went wrong? Is the system even up and running? Is the database not available? Did security not work? There's just so many things that go sideways if we're just returning a plain white screen with no response to that, right? So whether you're using Postman, whether you're using a web app on your phone, whether you're using some sort of browser-based React, Vue, etc. application, ensuring that some sort of good error message goes back with, in a perfect world, a next best action indicated will do yourself and your future self, and maybe it's your past self, a huge favor for yourself as you're going forward. And I get the current Quarkus, Jackson, JAXB libraries don't exactly do this really well. You know, one of the ones that I've talked to that I wish I could get some people thinking about is just some validation of the values going in. You know, going back to that first name example, if I pass in first name as an uppercase N, but you guys expect it as a lowercase n, why can't there be some like error checking like, hey, this passed in value was ignored? And, you know, let us know that that was the case, right? You know, give ourselves a little bit of humanity, if you will, some empathy for the users that ultimately have to program against this stuff. And I get once it's deployed, that might not nearly be as important, but as we're developing these systems, as we're creating them, having that available to us, I think is really, really, really important. A couple things that I think about for this JSON speaking endpoint is just a get health check method, right? Can I simply make a call to it and get an idea that, you know, we think everything's running here? And, you know, not just that it's like returning some data, but like, is the database available to us? You know, if we're talking to messages or message queuing or other things, are those services available to us? You know, if you're storing stuff to disk or Amazon S3 or something along those lines, are you doing the right things there? Are they available? Are they up? You know, maybe some metrics about how many things you've written to, which we'll get to here in point 10. One of the other ones that just drives me nuts is just a build date, a last build date, or even a version number. There's a lot of different ways to think about that, but I'm amazed at how many times, and you know, can't really see your hands here unless you came off camera or on camera, but how many of you have had the problem of like, hey, is it the most current build for our microservices? You know, how do we check that? And I'm amazed at how many times, you know, people are like, oh man, the build didn't take the way I thought it should, and we're using the wrong version of the microservices, and now we're stuck. Now we're trying to figure out what it is we should be doing, where it is we're going. And the last one, at least at this point, is a get uses method. And to me, this is some self-documentation around how I would expect this endpoint to be used, or this, you know, domain-driven maybe set of endpoints might be used. And I get to a point, Swagger helps us with this, but I also think that Swagger just kind of misses some of the nuances of some words about what would be the order of operations to do things. Oftentimes in our microservices, we have to string together multiple methods together to get something to happen. And that isn't always intrinsically obvious to just the casual observer of a bunch of Swagger endpoints. And you probably need some sort of other documentation to help you with that. The headache you get, though, in most organizations and a lot of places is this idea that where does this documentation live? Who keeps it updated? And with different versions of APIs morphing potentially very quickly, it's almost impossible to keep all of that up to date. So I really like to think about, you know, what can I do to help my future self, but also my team members to be able to make something like that work. Another thought I'll put into the mix is that remember, when you're creating your microservices and deploying them, while you are creating and developing them, you have access to the console or terminal. When they are deployed, more than likely, your end users do not. And what does that mean for you as a developer? What does that mean for them as a developer? And what does that mean for agility and throughput for your organization if they don't have easy access to that? I think that's just some of the thoughts of human-centeredness around development and these microservices that I'd like you to think a little bit more about as you're going along with this. Another one that I have here is this idea of basically passing things back. In a lot of examples, I see that you have a JSON object for taking in the data and a JSON object for taking the data back out. My modality in almost every case, I really haven't come up with one where I don't like this, is that, and I do get you're probably passing extra strings around potentially, but I basically take in the object and pass back the object. And this kind of goes back to that white screen of death idea and some of the self-documenting idea. At a very low level, if I do a post to a endpoint or a get or whatever, and even if I'm not getting any data back, at least I'm giving people back a JSON structure that will be the same JSON structure that they will pass in. And I think that greatly simplifies and self-documents in a way what it is we as software developers are expecting for input, but also what can people expect as an output. And by linking those together, you're creating one less class potentially. I get you are adding in maybe a little bit of extra stuff, But the little bit of extra stuff you have around there is also mitigated a little bit by having the JSON persistence object, which basically takes out the annotations around the database things that are going on that have nothing to do with this object. Or vice versa, if you're passing around some sort of access token to get access to some other third-party service, like an access token to Facebook or Google or LinkedIn or whatever, that stuff doesn't necessarily have to be passed to your persistence object and stored off in your database, right? That is just something that doesn't potentially make a lot of sense sometimes. So another thing to think about is testing these things. So, you do want to do test-driven development and all of this stuff. You definitely want to make your life a little bit easier. On the other side of that, I don't know that these data holder objects, if you will, just these Java beans, if you will, need any testing per se. The exercising of the endpoint of API test user in this case, and the exercising of service test user, a little bit of a typo there. Delivered this talk several times. I haven't noticed that one. Anyway, that those test classes would be the way to exercise the majority of what's going on within your objects and being able to exercise this top to bottom. And remember, the JVM is enforcing a firewall around this, so that all you really need to do is test this in the spirit of Linux and well-known systems having one thing and doing it well, like the ls command or sed or grep or any one of these things. This is taking that maybe to a little bit of an extreme, that just the package is the thing that does something well. And via the JVM provided firewall, you're enforcing this idea that this is a set of classes that go together. They basically work together as the package as an object, and you don't necessarily need to worry too much about different issues, different challenges there. A few other things to think about with testing. Nulls in Java are a thing. Nulls in databases hopefully are not a thing. And you definitely want to do some work around those JSON speaking objects that are storing this data. Ensure that you do not have any nulls available in there. So you want to initialize all your values on the way into that, such that empty strings at least are propagated instead of the keyword null. I'm not going to name the airline, but I looked at an airline website app a couple weeks ago, and they had null comma null in the UI, which I thought was a priceless leaking of somebody not initializing a value or a variable somewhere along the way. And as I say here, nulls in databases are really hard. We should basically outlaw them. You probably should write some test cases, some test classes to just validate that is happening. Values are initialized, and you're not having to worry too much about where and how things are being initialized in your code base, such that you've got good data storage habits and that you're not creating things that create problems for you down the road. Another one to think a little bit about is telemetry, right? This micrometer project is an absolutely amazing project. It is something that is pretty easy to inject in your code. In the simplest case, it allows you to get some timing around how long things are taking, but in other cases, it allows you to just do a simple counter of method invocations over time. And certainly with some monitoring and other things, you could look at those metrics being exposed and give yourself the ability to be able to remotely monitor, check, validate that things are moving forward as you would expect over time, and that you have the ability to just see that your systems are up and running. This is a slightly different way of looking at the health check notion of what I was speaking to earlier. And telemetry and the micrometer project has support for basically all the normal things that you're probably using in production today to look at this, so it can export data to all those different systems within this. Some future thoughts and some things that I've been thinking about. And if you have any interest about this, at the end of this, I'll give you some place to reach out to me, and I'd love to talk to you about it if you have any thoughts around this. One of the things I've been thinking about is Java records and immutable data objects, and where does that fit into the notion of those objects that I'm storing and marshaling and unmarshaling for your JSON objects. So I'm thinking a little bit about that, and where does that go in the future of this example. Thinking a little bit about interfaces and interfaces in the context of a Java interface, and not just a random interface or API you're defining, but the actual keyword interface, and what does that mean in the context of maybe creating public APIs that could be stored in this package structure, and how do they then get passed between them? Between those two of Java records and interfaces, what does that mean for being able to pass things at the message level across a single JVM to at least pierce some of that boundary that I'm enforcing? but still allow us to, in the future, take these packages and deploy them independently as independently run and microservices. So very, very interesting. All right. Vertex. So Vertex has a event bus. That was something to kind of speak to in the context of, you know, the majestic monolith. And when we're starting a project, it makes a lot of sense to just have these things out and about in one JVM as you're running them, but you want to have the JVM help you think a little bit more about where it is you're going and what it is that you're doing. I missed the third one there, but some type safety around JSON objects. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've been in projects and people are just struggling with like first name and F name and last name is upper and lowercase, and just, you know, there's just something inherent with IntelliSense and IDEs. There's something inherent with Java coding in general that just helps you out that we lose when we're exposing things as microservices. And I get there's things like Swagger. There's the I forget their name, the organization that has helped deliver Swagger, the Open API organization. That's not the right name. So there's some work there, but to me as a Java developer, it seems like something that's very, very interesting to me. The automatic deployment of these microservices by package. Could we automate with Knative or other things to automatically deploy these things as individual JVM'd things so that we can then automatically independently update them as they change, making us a little bit faster and a little bit more agile. So that is just something to think a little bit more about. Splicing in workloads for testing. You know, there's a write-up from the guys at Lyft, an absolutely amazing set of 4 or 5 blogs around that. I've read it a few times at this point. What does it mean to do local development and splice your code into a running either production instance with mirroring that data, or being able to look at the a test system that's generating data in the same way? And that's just another thing to think a little bit more about with this. And then the last thing that I'm thinking a little bit about is test coverage, right? When we write these test cases, these test code, if you will, how much of the code base are we covering? Are we covering it enough? Have we done all those different bases? And Max, I see you have a question with number 8. So let's go back to that one. Talk about number 8 a little bit more. All right, so number 8, that's a really good question. So some more detail on this one. And the thing that I have noticed in some projects is that they have 2 objects for the JSON stuff that's going in, right? And I'll get to number 3, 4, and 5 and talk about Lombok in a second. So I'll get there, my friend Max. So what I've noticed in a couple projects is that you have 2 objects that are defining a data type. One being the input object of JSON data and one being the return type for that JSON data. And in a few cases, if the humans aren't perfect, something like a first name might be a first capital N name on the input, but the return is a first name lowercase n. And that kind of cognitive dissonance drives me absolutely batty. And it should drive most humans batty because you're using a lot of brain power to just manage that difference between the input versus the output. One of the things that I talk about in other things with developers is this idea that I want to have balance with everything I do. And that if I have the ability to write something out, I should have the ability to delete it or update it or edit, right? Like there's a slap to the face of violating users' trust, if you will, if you are doing that kind of change or pivot to people. And I think the other side of this that I think is also important is that by returning the object you are expecting you're giving people some self-documentation of that to make your life a little bit easier on that. So my mouse is taking things over. And then a few more tips on number 9. So testing. So the big thing on testing for this one is this idea that we don't necessarily need to test all 4 of these objects. Organically, the data holding objects will be tested and validated and just exercised for you, if you will, because they really are just simple member variable only holding objects with annotations. That's all they're doing. There's no business logic in them. There's nothing, no methods in them except a toString to help echo out the data of them. And that's it. So that just makes your life a little bit easier and what's going on there. So the project lombok.org, that one, let me go refresh my brain. I know I've looked at that in a second, but let me look at that. Right. So one of the things that Lombok will do, or at least I haven't used Lombok myself, but one of the things that I did speak to a little bit earlier is that it is certainly very easy to right click and generate getters and setters in your code base. And I would think most people think that that kind of activity is free. I would argue from the maintenance point of view, from just, yeah, right, that it definitely can help with some of the boilerplate, but this method of writing code just gets rid of even that even existing in your objects, right? And I get that Lombok and some other libraries might create that under the covers, but is that a source of bugs? Like, is that something else that's going on, right? That the idea with this is that I just do a protected or an empty member variable and no public methods. I don't really need to worry about any boilerplate code at all. It just kind of all can be wired together, and I don't need to deal with yet another project and another thing that I got to manage and worry about in my project. So just something to think about there, Max. And, I'd love to talk about this more. And of course, Mario and Max are flying along in the chat, arguing with each other. So I appreciate that, guys, totally. What's that one from Journey G? In the tip that every model should have a two-stream method. You had personal data written to a log file. Do you think that is a way to go? I would say that if you had personal data, like a social security number, or maybe a birth date, that you might mask it or obfuscate it a little bit. I probably would not want to completely mask it to let people know what's going on there. Or maybe I would just mask it with asterisks, shift 8s, for at least the length of data I had there. So at least it would change it across different inputs. So I, as a user, could at least see what's going on there. But then the other part of it is, where and how do you have logging and what do you turn on when things are going on, right? So that's something to think about with that one. It's certainly something I've thought about with my projects. With that, do you all have any other questions along the way? And feel free to come off mute if you want to. I think I've covered everything that I got to think. Quarkus booth duty isn't going to happen today. Sorry about that. But the LinkedIn and the example code, well, I don't have it there yet, but that's hanging out there. But if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'd love to talk about that for sure. Max, yeah, these slides are available. If the meeting organizers email me, I'll happily push out a PDF. If you friend me on LinkedIn and ask for them there, I'll happily send them there also. That URL should work. And you know what? Why don't I make your life a little bit easier, and I'll put that in the chat. Don't you hate it how mice sometimes go away from you? What is going on here? I'm clicking on that. There we go. Oh, it's not. I'm having a bad day. Anyway, let's go back to this, and then I can go put this in the chat. Are there any other questions from anybody else? There you go. Like me, friend me on LinkedIn, and just ask for these slides. I'll happily send them along, and I'll give them back to the meeting organizers. That's all I had on this talk. Does anybody else have any other questions? Anything else they'd like to ask? And more importantly, if you think this is a totally bogus idea and doesn't make any sense, I'd love to hear about that from you. I'd really love to hear how this idea, if you've tried it and it didn't work, and why. But academically, in my head, this is a way to really slow down the blast radius of what it is we're writing as software developers. It allows us to use the constructs of Java. And you know what? As I look at things like the Nest.js and other JavaScript frameworks, they do a lot of stuff like this. So this isn't too far afield of what other communities are doing in software development, but I do completely understand that this is completely orthodoxy busting of what we've done for 22, 25, 26, 27 years as Java developers. And I admit this might be blowing your mind a little bit, but anyway, that's all I have. So if there's no other questions, I guess back to the moderator, and I guess it's beer 30 if you're over in Europe. For me, it's only 11 a.m., so I probably can't quite have a drink just yet.